So today we talk about we'll begin talking about the first artist that we're going to concentrate on. Remember I said last time that what we'll do in this course, we'll just take a few artists and try to look at them in some depth. That's the approach we'll take. And the first of the post-impressionist artists I want to look at is Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh. Born in 1853, lived till 1890. So if you just do the basic maths, you'll notice that he didn't live very long. He actually died really very young. So most of the art we'll see is art by a relatively young artist. That's probably worth bearing in mind. You know, it's a little bit different from the career, say, of an artist like Monet or Rembrandt or Titian, artists who maybe lived to quite a great age and had late periods. Van Gogh never had a late period. Actually, his artistic career is truncated not just by dying young, but by the fact he didn't start as an artist very early. It took him a while to decide to become an artist. Basically, he made that decision in the summer of 1880. So we're talking about a decade of artistic production. And in fact, almost a very large part of the output of Van Gogh that we are aware of, that the most famous works of that artist were produced really within the last 2 to 3 years of his life, 88, 89, 90. So a very concentrated weight of production at one phase at the very end of his very short life. He's often thought of as a post-impressionist. That implies an artist of a generation that comes after Impressionism, that have taken something from Impressionism but in some sense moved beyond Impressionism. Impressionism, a kind of painting that is very much concerned with capturing effects of light, capturing natural effects, atmospheric effects, working in a sort of realistic or naturalistic way, not so much intruding the artist's own subjectivity, but just trying to record what's actually there. And what you see, say in the case of Monet, what you see more than what you know is there, trusting your eye. The Impressionist project, it leads to artists working out of doors, because how can you capture effects of light unless you're working out of doors? It leads to a certain kind of sketchiness, because if you're not working in a studio, you can't come back again and again to produce very refined, finished artworks. And it leads to brighter color, because to capture effects of light in paint, well, artists felt that they needed to use brighter colors. Van Gogh was interested in Impressionism and interested himself in working directly from nature. He worked out of doors right to the end of his life. But an observation is a really important aspect of his work. But at the same time, it wasn't sufficient for him. He wanted something more. So you could say that something more above everything else was to express something of his own feelings in art. Art is not just about description, it can also be about expression. And for Van Gogh, he was one of the sort of founders of a modern language of expressivity in art, one of the first expressionist artists, you could say. And what he did was that he heightened colors and distorted forms in his paintings in order to express feelings. It's a movement away from realism in art, you know. Maybe realism is a little bit successful as a style if you want to paint an apple. Actually, if you try painting an apple yourself or drawing an apple, you'll find it's not so easy to capture that apple in an image of that apple. But when you're talking about a feeling, like a feeling of sadness, for instance, you can't possibly describe that in a realistic language. What shape is sadness, you know? So if you're trying to deal with expressive content in art, you need some other means to follow. So here is an artist who learnt from Impressionism, its use of pure colour, its fragmentation of brushwork, but pushes it into some new territory, uses something from the language of Impressionism, but for his own purposes. And above all, it's through colour that we'll see that he makes his exploration and leaves a legacy to later artists, using colour in what, from a realist point of view, is quite an arbitrary way, a non-naturalistic way for emotional expressivity. A lot of this late 19th century art we'll see is an art which explores the means of painting itself, not just using paint to represent the world, but shows an interest in exploring the actual materials or language of forms and colours itself. So Van Gogh is part of that tendency, a concern more with the formal dimension of painting. Now, when we come to talk about Van Gogh, in some ways it's more difficult than many other artists, because he's one of those artists that's become famous as a personality in some way. A lot of people who don't know much about art have some idea of what Van Gogh was, or he cut his ear off, he shot himself, Starry, Starry Night. You know, it's all this kind of, there's already a kind of myth out there about him. He's appeared in movies, Lustful Life starring Kirk Douglas, or Kurosawa's Dreams. It has a section where you wander around inside a Van Gogh painting. And people from all different walks of life and backgrounds are interested in him. You know, you might see a poster of a Van Gogh painting in a student dormitory, or you might see during the 1980s you would see a Van Gogh painting in a bank vault in Japan owned by a banker or something like that. You know, it's all sorts of people from different walks of life would have an interest in his work. So there's a certain, I think, something of a stripping away that we have to do of the mythology before we can get to the actual person. Or looking at this another way, we can say it's an investigation of the value but also the limits of biography as a tool in art history. People often use a biographical method in art history, look at the artist's life to explain their art. And that can be very illuminating, but I think you have to be a little bit careful. You know, those Van Gogh paintings, almost all of them are still with us today. You can go to some places like the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam and you can see a great many of them. And in a sense that is Van Gogh. But Van Gogh's life, well, he's dead. You know, what do we know about his life? We know relatively little. We don't know most of the things he did, we don't know. Most of the things he thought, we certainly don't know. His life is actually something very dark compared to his art, which is here today, can be seen now if you're in the place where those artworks are. So to use biography to explain the art is to use something dark to explain something bright, if you like. It's actually a funny strategy, and you should be aware if you use biography how difficult that would be. It's an overused strategy for Van Gogh, I would say. To the extent that the biographical method is useful in art history, it should be useful for all artists, but there's a sort of tendency to apply it more to artists whose life seems very dramatic in some way, you know, it has a sort of story to it, or a very expressive kind of artist, like Van Gogh. So something to be wary of. There can be a certain circularity of explanation. How do we explain this Van Gogh painting? Oh, he painted that way because he was sad. Why was he? How do we know he was sad? Well, look at the painting. It's a sad, sad painting. You know, I mean, that's the sort of danger that could come up. And there's one practical reason why you can see a lot of biographical approaches to Van Gogh's art is that he wrote a lot of letters, primarily to his brother, and his brother was an art dealer. Theo Van Gogh was an art dealer, so they could talk in an elevated way about art, not just about everyday matters. So there's that enormous resource that can be used, and that really is a very valuable resource. And all those letters are online in both the Dutch originals and the English translations in one website. There's also a website that gives all of the paintings of Van Gogh as well. So compared to many other artists, he's an easy artist to study in that basic sense. You could break his life down to three broad phases. This is oversimplifying his life as an artist. The first is when he's living in Northern Europe. He's a Dutch artist, so he's mostly living in Holland. He spends a bit of time in Belgium. He also visits England and so forth. Then from 1886 to 1888, he's in Paris, basically, moves south. And then after 1888, he moves to the south of France. At the very end of his life, he moves back up to a place near Paris, Auvers. But those are the basic three phases of his life. And as I said before, he started a little bit late as a painter, as an artist. He worked for an art dealer before, though, so that already gave him a lot of awareness of the history of art, a sophisticated take on art. And I'd like you to see him as a very intelligent, knowledgeable painter. He spoke many different languages, for instance. He was aware of music. He's very aware of art history. He lived in London for a while. One time he was there working with an art dealer. Another time he came back, worked as a school teacher in Britain. So he'd been around a bit before he became a painter. His brother was working as an art dealer in Paris, so when he moved to Paris he was able to join the art circle there. He also then became very religious and worked as a sort of lay evangelical preacher, very intense in his religious beliefs. His father was a preacher too. He got dismissed from that, from being too zealous, too extreme. Evangelical preachers can be pretty extreme already sometimes, and he was too extreme. So that was someone very involved with their religious beliefs. And something you can say perhaps about him is that maybe some of that religious belief and energy was pushed into his artistic practice. Somehow art for him had to do more work than it did do for some earlier artists. It had to express feelings, convey ideas, and including even, you could say in the broader sense of the word, religious ideas or spiritual ideas might be a better word. Art in the modern period starts to come to be required to do more. It's an era where traditional beliefs are breaking down, and art has to fill the gaps sometimes. So let's start looking at specific images. I've said how most of the images that are most famous of Van Gogh's are the ones he created in the last 2 to 3 years of his life, and we're certainly going to spend enough time looking at those. But I also want to look at some of his early work. So we'll start by looking at some works from the northern phase. That's partly because I feel those earlier works are underrated, but it's also part of a general strategy that I like to show some artists' earlier works, because I think often you can see the development of of an artist that way if you see the beginnings before they arrive at their signature style. I would say he doesn't fully arrive at his signature style till about 1888, but of course there's lots of interesting things before that. I'm starting off by showing you a drawing. Van Gogh's much more famous for his paintings and his use of colour, but here's a monochrome drawing. Most drawings stay with the world of monochrome. So this is 1882. He'd had some training. The training was with a painter from the main school of painting, the kind of group of painters in Holland called the Hague School, Hague. I'm very, very sorry, but they haven't provided a whiteboard in this room. There's nowhere I can write down words. The Hague School, the Hague is just the name of one of the towns or cities in Holland. Mauve, Mauve, his name is actually on the slide list. We'll see one of his paintings later, about halfway down the comparison images. Someone he learnt a bit from the end of 1881 onwards. He studied a bit with Mauve. Mauve and the other artists of the Hague School, you could call them realist artists, influenced by the French realist painters like Courbet and Millet. Millet himself was also an artist that Van Gogh greatly admired. Mostly his work of this early Dutch phase is realist in style, and like the realist artists, there's a great concern with, human suffering, the plight of poor or disadvantaged people. There's a great sort of sense of empathy here in this old man grieving. This is around 1882. He actually comes back to this image much, much later in his life, towards the end of his life, and makes a painting titled something like at Eternity's Door or something like that. The idea then being that this is someone just one step from death. So Van Gogh sometimes does that, comes back to themes. To a large extent, he was somewhat self-taught as an artist. I wouldn't say he's an artist who has a fantastic overflowing excess of technical skill. There are some artists right from the beginning of their life are like that, but that's not necessarily an advantage. I think of an artist like John Singer Sargent. He's a great artist, massive technical facility, but somehow it can be a limitation to you as an artist. Van Gogh wasn't like that. Cézanne we'll also look at. He wasn't like that. His early work is not overflowing with excess of technical skill either. But somehow a lack can be turned into something positive. That's an interesting lesson in life, in fact. I don't want to emphasize that he was a terrible artist. Actually, there's a lot of skill here. And one can see, even at the beginning of his artistic career, 2 years into his artistic career at the most, some of the characteristics which will be there in his later paintings. Even though a painting and a drawing, technically it's a very different medium, you can see quite a strong concern with outline. And we can see this very prominent individual strokes, strong strokes of the pencil. You're aware of them as individual strokes. They don't describe anything, they just are what they are. So these are characteristics you'll see in his later paintings. Somehow it's more acceptable in painting to see things which are not realistic. We don't think, gosh, why has he done that? There's no such thing, would have been no such thing in the model, so why is it there in the painting, but in the drawing? But sometimes with painting we become less accepting. At least a non-expert way of looking at paintings often finds departures from realism a little bit difficult. So some notions already that are already there for his later work. He was very interested, in all kinds of realist art. So apart from the Dutch Hague School artists like Mauve, and apart from French artists like Millet and Courbet, I'll show examples of their works later, so I'm not showing them now. But I'll just show you one other artist that he admired. Luke Fields is a British realist artist of this time. This is applicants for admission to a casual ward. He, as I said before, he spent some time in Britain, so that's why he was particularly sensitized to British art. This is from 1874. He also knew these works from illustration. At that time, a common way in which art was propagated was through a print being made, an engraving being made after a popular painting, and then disseminated, through mass reproduction. And Van Gogh kept copies of these magazines, these English illustrated magazines, really before photography replaced engraved illustrations as a means for conveying information. So these are poor people lining up to have some kind of overnight shelter and hopefully food, So again, there's that sense of empathy with the downtrodden. Notice how the whole painting is conceived in tonal terms, in terms of lights and darks, this predominant brownness. Colour is not important. And I would say that's the case with Van Gogh's own work in most of this early period. It has this tonal way of thinking, and distinct for his later work, which will become much more coloristic. So this work here by Van Gogh, the Sale of Crosses at Newnan Cemetery, it belongs in that category as well. Colour is not that important, really. Here we're looking at a watercolour, in fact. So he's trying it with different mediums. It's a fairly small painting. That's one thing it's hard to convey when we look at images through reproductions. Everything comes up on the screen the same size, and things are blown up beyond the scale that they should be looked at. That subverts the aesthetic project of the artist in many cases. But like Luke Field or other realist artists, he's showing concern with the life of ordinary people. It's a little incident in the town of Newnan, which is where his father was living. He ended up living with his father for a while. And this building is a church, and he comes back to paint this church many times. The church is starting to fall into ruins. And I think he becomes interested in it as something of a symbol of the decline of the church, or the decline of religion in the modern world, something like that, some symbolic associations there. But there's just a little incident of people buying up bits of wood, crosses for marking graves. Some seem to be in use as grave markers. There's a grave yard around the church. Others seem just to be there for people to take off. But because a grave marker cross is not a neutral just piece of lumber, a piece of wood, it does carry certain connotations. We start thinking about death, and indeed that's what Van Gogh would want us to be thinking about. I think he's trying to do something more than a literal, realistic description of the life of the peasantry. That's what I'm trying to say. And that can be evidenced a little bit by something he says in his letters to his brother. So I'm going to read out a little bit of what he says in his letter. Now, I know that you won't be able to follow exactly everything when I'm just reading out at you, but I just want you to get a kind of flavour. I'll do this quite often. I choose not to put large items of text on a PowerPoint. I don't like to use PowerPoints that way. I want you to be thinking visually, looking all the time at visual images, not reading big bunches of text. So here's Van Gogh talking to his brother Theo. I wanted to about this painting, really. I wanted to express how these ruins show that for ages the peasants have been laid to rest in the very fields which they dug up when alive. I wanted to express what a simple thing death and burial is, just as simple as the falling of an autumn leaf, just a bit of earth dug up, a wooden cross. The fields around, where the grass of the churchyard ends, beyond the little wall, beyond the little wall, form a last line against the horizon, like the horizon of the sea. And now these ruins tell me how a faith and a religion moulded away, strongly founded though they were, but how the life and death of the peasants remains forever the same, budding and withering regularly, like the grass and the flowers growing there in that churchyard. It's a very rich description of what, I sort of likening the life and death cycle of the peasants to the natural rhythms of the plants growing and being harvested and dying. Merging culture with nature in that way. Now, it's very interesting to hear what Van Gogh thought he was trying to express, but I think it's also important to say that I don't think he's quite got this across in the painting itself. To me, I feel he doesn't quite have a language yet to express those kind of ideas. The realist language he's using isn't quite up to expressing those kind of symbolic meanings. There's a kind of gap between his intention and the execution. So that's one of the reasons why artists make changes in their styles. Why is there stylistic evolution in art? Because not I would say because an artist suddenly wants to do something different just for the pure sake of novelty, or because an old way of painting is out of fashion or something like that. That would be a kind of trivial motivation. It's because the language you're using can't say what you want to say, therefore you have to develop a new language. So it's a realist style, but we can see it somehow not quite sufficient for his purpose. Just throwing in briefly a looking back at an earlier artist's work. This is a great German romantic artist, Caspar David Friedrich. He also made this painting, The Abbey in the Oakwood, which is trying to represent a sense of, a church in ruins. It has symbolic connotations. This is about 1810, I think, this one. So Van Gogh, nothing that any artist does is in a vacuum. There are always earlier artists who have already helped build the symbolic association of certain things. Back to Van Gogh. The Loom. It's a very simple painting. Again, a small painting of a hand loom weaver. Someone weaving cloth by hand. Now, yes, there were still people doing that at that time in Newnan where he was living, but they were very much under pressure because of the mechanization of weaving. And this is one of the great changes of the Industrial Revolution when it first happened in Britain, was changes in spinning and weaving, mechanization of spinning and weaving. So a handloom weaver at that point in time, early 1880s, is very much under pressure from the cheaper productivity of machines. And I think that's part of Van Gogh's motivation in picking the topic. One even has the way he's represented the figure by choosing this angle, looking through the loom at the weaver, almost to get the sense of the weaver as somehow trapped, imprisoned by his loom. I think we're getting that kind of idea. So social concern and empathy. And again, very much this predominantly brown tonality which is there in so much of his early Dutch works. Not an artist thinking in terms of colour, and it's important to bear that in mind, I think, because he becomes so much of a colourist later. then we understand that as a transformation, a giving up or changing of something that's fundamental to his earlier practice. Again, a small painting, the still life with open Bible. This is 1885. Well, still life was pretty much a Dutch invention. Some sense here is Van Gogh looking to his national roots. I think that is important, to have a sense that artists sometimes are connected to a national tradition. And maybe it's a little bit more the case then than it would be today. Nowadays we're living in the digital age. All the world's knowledge is sort of a click or two away, practically. Everything is sort of available to us. We need to remember that this is actually just a phenomenon of the last 15, 20 years, really. Before that, knowledge was still available. It was available in a form of libraries. If you had access to a library, as you did as a student, for instance, then you have an immense archive of knowledge just a few minutes walk away. But this is an era before printed books. Before printed books with colour reproductions, put it that way. It's not so easy to find out about what's going on. You can't travel to museums. There aren't so many museums. The history of art isn't sort of laid bare for you in quite the way it is today. So it might be natural that you're more aware of the art of your own country or the artists of your own country and be more influenced by them. Nowadays, artists might be influenced by things that are geographically quite distant, because the internet is kind of non-topographical in that sense. So a still life, relate it to this painting by Gogh, who is one of the circle of Rembrandt. In fact, this painting was sometimes still titled Rembrandt's Mother. Now it's given usually a more neutral title, Old Woman Reading. It's paintings like this, or someone reading an old sort of religious text that lie behind the images like this. Or I just choosing this pretty much at random, an example of a Dutch 17th century still life, just to remind you how important still life was in Holland. This is Herman von Steenwyck, still life, an allegory of the vanities of human life. Now, a lot of still life was about trying to tell you some moral meaning about you should be concerned with life after death. Don't waste your life concerned with superficial things. Remember, you're all going to die, and what you should live your life with an awareness of that, of mortality, and think of eternal things. So, for example, here, this lamp that's just been extinguished, that's an obvious symbol of the shortness of something, things coming to an end. Well, this is the ultimate symbol you could have of the shortness of life, a human skull. Not uncommon to see in a still vanitas still life, as they were called, those still lifes that concern themselves with the vanity of human existence. A lot of things that people at the time would have considered treasures, some exotic seashell, or looks like a Japanese sword, very exotic treasures, or the pleasures of life like music. But what the painting is saying is everything like that is going to go, or you're going to go, and it'll just be a bunch of trash in some corner of a dead person's house or something. It won't be a great treasure anymore. So this is a kind of background we might bring to Van Gogh's painting. But I don't think he's straightforwardly producing a vanitas still life. There are some elements that might suggest that, like an extinguished candle. It's a little bit like that extinguished lamp in the von Steenwyck painting. very simple. What do we have? Basically, the main things we have are a big old family Bible and a small French novel. We can tell that by the yellow colour of the cover. And if we are careful, look carefully, we can see what novel it is. It's a particular novel. It's a novel by the French realist novelist Zola, Z-O-L-A. The Joy of Living. So yeah, you could say that fits in the world of the vanitas, still life, the idea of the joys of life. Actually, if you read that novel, you find it's not so upbeat after all. But anyway, the title implies the joys of life, whereas the Bible is about more serious things, not just about life, but about what happens after life, and leading a moral life, not leading a life of indulgence. I think it's pretty clear he's trying to put the two side by side as a contrast. They contrast most obviously in size. They contrast in colour. The cover of the novel is much brighter. This is very bound, leather-bound book. This is just sort of paperback, if you like. This one sits solidly on the table. This one almost wants to fall off the table. It's not aligning itself to the table it's on. So they have, I think there's a deliberate contrast between them. And I think what I would like to say about the image is that it's Van Gogh thinking about two different paths in life that are facing him at the moment. He's living in Holland. He's with his father, who's a preacher. Then that is represented by the Bible. It's very similar to his own father's family Bible, in fact. That represents tradition or religion. And then this novel represents the modern or the secular life. Maybe you could also say represents different spaces. This is a Dutch Bible. This is a French novel. His brother is living in Paris. He's corresponding with him about all the art that his brother is seeing in Paris, and he's attracted by the idea of moving to Paris. So I want to suggest it's maybe like a sort of dilemma the artist is facing between two different routes in life or two different philosophies of living. And he puts that dilemma into the image for us. There are paintings in the history of art that have tried to show dilemmas. This is The Choice of Hercules. It's actually by Annibale Carracci. Different artists represent the same theme. So this is an early Baroque, early 1700s painting. Hercules has to choose between the path of virtue and the path of vice. And of course the path of virtue is an uphill struggle. It's not an easy route, but of course that's the route he should be taking, whereas vice is a sort of easy downhill path and a more superficially attractive one. So there's a kind of dilemma presented, but it's a little bit different from Van Gogh's painting, because here the dilemma is, it's clear what route he should take. In fact, the story tells us what choice he makes. But here the dilemma is something he and maybe we as the viewer are confronted with. We're asked to decide. It's not so easy. It isn't. There's no clear right and wrong. Although in fact the choice that Van Gogh makes is to go to Paris. So in a way he chooses the flimsy modern yellow novel route to life. Leaving Holland behind. And interestingly, the most colourful part of the painting as well. He's talking with his brother in the letters about colour and black and white quite a lot at this time. So paintings that initially look just simple realist paintings, but I'd like to say they have more meaning in them, or he's trying to say something more. Whether he quite gets that across always, I'm not sure whether he does, because the language of the painting doesn't quite allow it. Old shoes with laces. It's a picture of a pair of boots, but somehow I think it's not just about the boots, because they're not boots that have just been bought in a shop, for instance. They seem very worn, and they've taken on the personality of a particular owner. So I want to say in a way that they are like a portrait by proxy. We're learning about the owner of the boots by looking at the boots. Metonymy or synecdoche, that's a common trope in writing or speaking, that you describe the whole by a part, or something by what is contiguous to it. When you talk about wanting to take someone's hand in marriage, of course you don't just want the hand. Or you say this land is crown land, it's owned by the king, but you say crown. You use the crown to describe instead of king. So it's a similar kind of logic to that. Van Gogh also did a portrait of his dead father. I'm calling it a portrait in a similar way, where he showed his pipe and tobacco pouch on his table, objects very closely associated with his father, to represent his father rather than showing his father directly. And of course later on in life, one of his most famous paintings is a portrait of a chair, his own chair. You can say that's a kind of self-portrait by proxy in a way. So it's a still life, but it's about people too, things standing in for something larger. This is actually a painting that's been discussed quite a lot, not just by art historians, but even by philosophers. The German philosopher Heidegger wrote about it, and the art historian Meyer Shapiro responded, and then a French philosopher Derrida wrote about it, and American literary theorist Frederick Jameson wrote about it. So a lot of people have written about this image, or actually it's part of a group. There are more than one of them. Again, it's very tonal, not thinking in terms of colour, thinking in terms of light and dark, quite thickly painted. There's a kind of distortion. Part of the distortion is the distortion of the boots being distorted by whoever wore them and so forth, but it's also a distortion imposed visually on the image. Sometimes people say, by painting boots, he's painting, it's image of peasant life. Remember, the realist art is very interested in peasant life. But actually that's not quite true. The peasants would tend to wear clogs, the wooden shoes. Even today in Holland, some farmers might wear those wooden clogs. A lot of the clogs are made for selling to tourists, but actually some are still worn by the farmers. So a pair of boots like this is more something to be associated with an artisan, a craftsman of some kind. And I think that's Van Gogh's self-identification. In the 19th century, a lot of artists are concerned with trying to raise their social status. The emphasis, when I talked last week about academic training, there's a lot of emphasis on learning anatomy and a learning perspective, because these are intellectual skills. Van Gogh kind of repudiates that. He's saying my identification is more with a craftsman. I've got one or two statements by him that kind of convey that way of thinking. So this painting I'm seeing as part of that identification with a craftsman. In one of his letters to his brother, he says, painters should work as regularly and be as productive as shoemakers. Actually, not just any kind of craftsman, but a craftsman who makes shoes, significantly. And he says, I would rather be a shoemaker than a musician in colours. So there's that identification. This is probably the most well-known or most sort of significant, ambitious work of his early Dutch phase. This is the Potato Eaters of 1885, perhaps his first masterpiece. You can see in terms of the composition there's more going on. It's not just one figure, it's many figures. It's not just a simple still life, although there are still life elements in it. It's a more composed work. In fact, he did many smaller studies in preparation from it, portraits from life. He's working from life. These are not just made-up types of peasants. They are actually a particular family that he was staying with. He paid them to pose for him. That's the relationship to his models. He knew them well, but it's a kind of commercial transaction in a way. They're shown having their meal by, it's a nighttime scene, we can see by the lamp. It's a very simple meal, just sort of potato and coffee, it seems, to indicate their poverty, the simplicity of their life. He's identifying very much with them and wants us to do so, creating this sense of a simple life. Again, very much in the vein of realist art, commitment to describing poverty and peasant life. Very dark palette again, thinking in terms of lights and darks. He says at one point, I've tried to emphasize that these people eating their potatoes in the lamplight have dug the earth with those very hands they put in the dish, and so it speaks of manual labour and how they've honestly earned their food. He also says he wanted the colour of the painting to be the colour of a dirty potato. It's almost like he wants to link the style of the painting with the content of the painting. Actually, that line recalls what the biographer of the French painter, realist painter Millet, said about Millet's painting of the sower, which we'll be looking at later. He said that a biographer called Gautier described it as painted with the very earth that the sower is planting. Again, linking style and content, and that's, I think, something Van Gogh is picking up. The dark palette relates to the Hay School. We could say to another artist of the Hay School. I mentioned Mauve. He is Israel's. Like Van Gogh, Israel's has emphasized the hands and the face. See that in both paintings, the gnarled hands of Van Gogh. It's something, and there's this sort of expressive emphasis on faces and hands. Van Gogh talks about Israel's in the same way as he would talk about Mauve. Great admiration for him. One can go further back to Rembrandt. It's one of my themes to say how much he is connected to Dutch traditions. Rembrandt's Supper at Emmaus. It's a religious meal scene. After Christ comes back to earth, or comes back to life, as it were, this is a moment where he's suddenly recognized by his disciples while they're having a meal together. They suddenly realized who their dinner companion is. Well, I think that with the Van Gogh, one also has something of a sense of the meal as having sort of a sort of ritual quality to it, some sort of vaguely religious or sacred connotation. Well, there's a religious image on the wall, at least. That gives us some sense of that. Rembrandt certainly is an artist he greatly admired. The lighting, the spotlighting effect that you get in the Van Gogh painting, something like the dramatic light effects you can get in Rembrandt, the use of shadow, the quasi-religious overtone, all these things could be related back to Rembrandt. Van Gogh says it's perhaps not superfluous to point out how one of the most beautiful things done by the painters in this country, meaning Holland, has been the painting of black, which nevertheless has light in it. So I think very much he doesn't mention Rembrandt by name, but I think he's thinking of Rembrandt. We could also look at peasant painters painting meals like the Lenain brothers in 17th century France. They were out having a revival in the 19th century. Van Gogh would have known their work too. Or just the French realist artists themselves, like Courbet. For example, in this work you see Courbet putting figure with their back to us. That's something that happens in Van Gogh's painting. It's a little unusual strategy to put a figure right in the centre of the painting with their back to us. Space is a little bit distorted here, like where is this wall in relation to the table or in relation to the back wall? There's a kind of buckling or breaking down of spatial unity, just as there's distortion of the features and the hands. Spatial ambiguity. Those distortions will become much more noticeable in later works. Here's Van Gogh talking around this time about his work on this painting and writing to his brother, and in his letter he's talking not as if he's not painting but as if he's weaving a piece of cloth. Again, there's that identification with a craftsman which was there with the painting of the boots or even the painting of the loom, the weaver. All winter long I've had the threads of this tissue in my hands and have searched for the ultimate pattern, and though it has been a tissue of rough, coarse aspect, nevertheless the threads have been carefully chosen and according to certain rules, and it might prove to be a real peasant picture. I know it is, but he who prefers to see the peasants in their Sunday best may do as he likes. I personally am convinced I get better results by painting them in their roughness than by giving them a conventional charm. A peasant is more real in his rough everyday clothes in the fields than when he goes to church on Sunday in a kind of dress coat. In the same way, it would be wrong, I think, to give a peasant picture a certain conventional smoothness. What he's saying is that a sort of academic realist style would be inappropriate to painting this subject, the subject of peasants. Their life, to put it in an oversimplified way, their life is rough, and therefore, you need a style of painting that is rough. He's saying that style and content have to go together, that a certain kind of subject to paint it in an authentic way needs a certain kind of style. I'm talking, I suppose, about how a realist mode is starting to break down and why. He hasn't quite found the full answer to how he's going to represent things, but he's feeling an insufficiency with the realist mode that he's inherited at that point in time. Okay, let's have our break. I've delayed our break a little bit late, but let's have a 5 to 10 minutes break just to get your attention back. And then we'll start to look at his work in Paris, the second phase of his life.